So my name is David Ferranti, and I'm the head of the 3IE Washington office. And this session will be organized slightly differently. We'll first have a conversation with Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, whom I'll briefly introduce. And then we'll broaden the conversation and have one with Daniel Kaufmann, and I'll introduce him when we get to that point. In keeping with the practice for this meeting, I'm not going to go through the full lengthy introductions. With these two characters, that would take the whole hour and a half that we have. But I would like to start with one anecdote about Ngozi. And you've seen she's board chair of Gavi and a bunch of other things. She's also has been named by Forbes magazine one of the 50 greatest world leaders. That's one I tried for, but I didn't make. Also been named one of the top 100 most influential leaders. Forbes, the top 3 most influential women. And by somebody else, I don't remember who, the top most inspiring leaders. She has 10 honorary degrees, and she's on about 12 boards. But none of that is as important as the greatest honor of all, which is that she gets to be our speaker today for you. We're going to start out with a question for Ngozi that is going to help us ground truth the discussions we've had today about what is citizen engagement on the ground from the perspective of Ngozi, who's been Minister of Finance and grew up in her country, Nigeria. And I hope it's going to help us think a little bit more about some of the points that have come up today around the complexities of citizen engagement and accountable government, and not only the complexities of carrying it out, but of understanding what's working and what isn't, whether we call that evidence generation or evaluation or whatever it is. So, Ngozi, tell us a little bit about what you were telling me before about the road that needed building. And at this point, I think I would like to ask for the picture to be shown. Wow. Okay.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. Is it on now? Is it? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, this is. I think this one. It's on now. Can you hear me? Yeah. Yes. Okay. My voice is loud enough anyway. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. And yes, indeed, David, it's a big honor. He keeps dragging me into so many of the things he's trying to do. But I'm happy to be dragged. I see some wonderful colleagues in the room. You know, when David talked about this and the issue of citizen engagement and what it means, it was funny to me because I just had citizen engagement in action happen to me just 2 months ago, 3 months ago. And so I shared the story with David, and he said, why not share it here? And it's a good story that has to do with the World Bank. So I'm always excited when there's a good story about the World Bank. Because much as I was finance minister of Nigeria, people also associate me with the bank. So whenever anything goes wrong in Nigeria, they'll say it's Ngozi's fault or something. So I was quite happy. Now, this citizen engagement story, I'm sure all of you have one or the other you have to tell, so it's not extraordinary, but I thought I'd share. It happened in my husband's village, in our village. And the village is in the southeast of Nigeria, called Umudaisingu. And I came in 3 months ago, that's around December, 5 months ago then, to be met when I got to our house in the village by a delegation from the village. Now, the thing is that all these villages have had for years an ingrained systematic process of citizen consultation and engagement that is indigenous and cultural to them. And that's one of the things I wanted to say, because I was reading something about 10 lessons off a blog of the World Bank on lessons on citizen engagement. One of them said, you know, that Western models may not be exportable. That's one of the lessons. And I felt, is this really a lesson? You know, we should know that each place we go, there are embedded ways and means of consultation and engagement. And our first job, if we're doing a project or program, is to first find out what those are and whether they exist, and not think we can import models there. But back to my story. So these people came to me, and they were from the Umoda Development Union. So this is a group that talks to all the age grade groups in the village. The village is organized by age grades. So people who are born within 2 years are all grouped into the same age grade, and each has a name. My husband's age grade is Okezia. They were all born between 1947 to 1949. And when anything is going to happen in the village, these age grade groups are consulted. When you marry into the village, you become part of your husband's age grade. If you're not married and you're from the village, you belong to the age grade of the men, you know, with whom you were born. So there's a place for everyone. They had consulted and come to tell me that there was a World Bank project, which I knew was happening in the village, called New Map. And that New Map it's about soil erosion control in the southeastern states of Nigeria. They were going to work, this beautiful thing you see now graded was a path with gullies, cut, erosion, impassable, linking 3 villages. And it had been their wish for a long time that government or someone do something about this so the villages could connect, because they were all kin. So they came to tell me that this project was just going to go a quarter of the way and stop. It wasn't going to go the whole 2 or 3 miles of this road, and that more problems would be caused by their working on this section. More problems would be caused on the other section. And so they wanted the World Bank not to just do this, but to look at the entire stretch and deal with the soil erosion on it. And so they had come to me because, of course, I had something to do with the World Bank, and having duly consulted with all the age grades in the village. And so I said, okay, I knew about the road. I went to see it for myself, to see the problem they were complaining about. And I was able to contact the World Bank task team. First, the project manager on site, who said, look, I can't do anything. You have to talk to the World Bank and see if they are willing to shape the project, because we've got a certain amount allocated to it, etc. I'm proud to tell you that I got in touch with the World Bank team, let them know what the citizens of the village, what they were saying. And even though they had not calculated the cost of the entire stretch, which was a lot of work, they listened. They came by, they reassessed, reevaluated, and redid the plan. And there was additional financing that was done for this project so they could incorporate this. So I'm a very proud person to say that, you know, voices were heard and citizen engagement worked, at least in my village. So. And so, yeah, we took pictures. They were so proud. They had a kind of, after they graded the road and so on, a kind of ceremony. Those are the village elders and chiefs and the age grade people and so on. You know, they took us to the site. They now had a ceremony to celebrate it. So the Amos Abu is the task team leader, along with a whole other bunch of people. So
hold on to that story, and we're going to come back to it. It's a micro level. We're now going to shift to the macro level and begin to piece together what are some of the lessons that, Ngozi, you want to share with the group on all the issues we've been talking about today. At the macro level, when you were Minister of Finance, you wanted to know what people thought, what voters wanted, what villages needed, and you wanted to have evidence, and you wanted to have a richness of opinion. You wanted to hear what all the different points of view. You knew that people would disagree with you. But when you looked around for that evidence, it was hard to find. And so to go back to our discussions earlier this morning, we talked about evidence generators reaching out. We talked about translators. Remember, this conversation started with the first session with Lily and with Santiago, beyond translators to policymakers and the complexities that arise there. And tell us a little bit, Ngozi, about your experience feeling you were blindfolded by not having enough information.
Well, thank you, David. I think, at the macro level, when you're a policymaker and you're trying to really evaluate what people or the citizens feel about the policies that you're putting in place, there may be countries where the instruments at a macro level are available. So we have, I found in my country at the micro level, we had those mechanisms. But at the macro level, trying to gather evidence of citizen acceptance, rejection, assessment of policies was very difficult. The reason being that we didn't have any opinion research organizations that were indigenous. A lot of countries are allergic to opinion research because they don't really want to hear or know what citizens think at that level. And, but for me, coming from the discipline and background, it was a huge hole. So people would say when we implemented policies on privatization of enterprises, there were people who would say, this is terrible, people hate this is a bad policy. There were others who would say, this is wonderful, you've gotten the government out of this business where they were really messing up, and this is good. But there was no way of knowing. It was all anecdotal evidence. And anecdotes do not make for fact. So that was the gap I felt. And I really felt like I was wandering in the dark, not knowing whether, of course, you look at the results. You can also get the privatization. Did it deliver the fiscal dividends that you were looking for in terms of closing those revenue leakages through the state-owned enterprises? That could be one measure. Did it deliver the technology and the upgrade you were looking for? That could be another measure. So there are measures. But did it deliver what the citizens are looking for? How do you measure that? So to answer those questions and to get some facts was the gap. And I just didn't know what to do. It was only after I left government that it occurred to me that, we need to find some way of gathering this kind of information indigenously. And that led to the founding of an opinion research organization that I founded called NOI Polls, which I'm happy to say after 10 years is still functioning and does opinion research. So I went into a partnership with Gallup because we didn't have the technology, and they were wonderful. And we partnered for about 3 or 4 years. Initially, the first year, they were very magnanimous, but afterwards, they charged a price for it. But we learned, and after about 5 years, we were able to do all the analysis. And with that, we were able to pose these questions and go out and answer and find evidence on what citizens actually thought about some of the important policies that government was implementing. And it wasn't always the way we thought it would be, as you can imagine. So that provided very rich answers.
And tell us, build on that, Ngozi, and tell us a little bit about your idea going forward for organizations, locally based civil society organizations that can help fill that gap.
I think the other side of engagement is not only just directly getting information and evidence from citizens, but also seeing how civil society can better engage. Now, most of our countries have very vigorous civil society, lots in very many areas. But there are two things that I think I found missing in terms of engagement. One was capacity. Many of them are there but lack the capacity and the access to really be able to participate and help engage and help its citizens in a way that we would want. The second is, I don't know what to call this, but validation or validity. Not every civil society organization is equal to the other. I mean, there are so many different levels and types, and there are those who are enormously, have enormous integrity. There are those who are not lacking in integrity, but they are all mixed up together. So the issue was, one, how can we have an approach whereby we're able to, one, sort these civil society organizations, and two, provide those who need the help and capacity building or show the promise with the help they need in order for them to be able to engage profoundly within the society, with policymakers, with outsiders. I also had I don't know whether it's the good luck or whatever you want to call it, but whenever people would want to give grants to civil society organizations, I would get calls saying, Ngozi, do you know such and such an association in Kenya? Can we give them money? Can we help them? Can we work? What can we do? Can we work with them? And I thought, if we find a way of really systematizing and strengthening these organizations, not only will they be able to do more in terms of engaging citizens, but we'll have a schema of organizations whose integrity can be vouched for in some way that people can dial into and know that if we are working with this, there are certain fundamentals that have been respected. And so this idea of trying to come up with this capacity support / database to help civil society, because we need civil society. I really do not believe fundamentally that you can, hold government accountable unless you've got those outside voices that are pushing. And you've seen in country after country. But there must be outside voices who have the right agenda. There must be outside voices who are open themselves and full of integrity. There must be outside voices who are ready to be held accountable. So how do you find those voices that meet all these criteria that you can work with? So there's a little project that, David and I are trying to work on together that would actually start with Africa and try to craft an approach that would help us systematize and support civil society to give them strength, integrity, and a voice for our citizens. And that's another way of enhancing citizen engagement. So I didn't call it that, but all these things that we're trying to do to really bring to fore the voices of citizens and hold government accountable, there are ways and means of trying to do this. And, this is another one that I thought could be important.
Great. And Ngozi, I'm going to ask you another question in a little while, but not yet. But I want to tell it to all of us so you can be thinking about that. And that is, what would you like from evidence generators? You have been one, but you've also been on the receiving end. You've been a policymaker at the bank and most prominently as finance minister of Nigeria. So what from that perspective would you like more of or differently from what there is now from evidence generators? And for the audience, as you're thinking of questions when we get to that point in this conversation, what we've been hearing about here it fits within the discussion we've had about what is the ecosystem within which ideas about what works and what doesn't, what's effective policy and what's not, gets translated from the research to the thoughts and actions of policymakers. And that ecosystem includes some things that Ngozi has been talking about. It includes the importance of outside voices, but how do you know which voices to trust? So it includes civil society organizations, but it includes some careful thought about how you sift the wheat from the chaff. It includes the interactions that Ngozi has spoken about at the macro level and at the start about what happens at the village level. And so be thinking about all of that. And I want to now add one more thing, and that is, Ngozi, you've also had experience as minister dealing with powerful special interests, rent seekers, powerful elites. You have tried to bring about reform. You have dealt with difficult characters, and you face the problems not just of impunity, which we spoke about this morning, namely you have engagement, you have participation, but the government says, I'm not listening, I don't care, talk all you want. But beyond impunity, you have forceful perversion, special interests sort of pushing on the government to go the wrong way. And this is money, this is corruption, and it can be dangerous, literally dangerous. And you've written a book about that recently. It's your latest book. In fact, I think that's the title, isn't it? That Fighting Corruption Can Be Dangerous. Talk a little to us about that.
Not can be, is.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, I'm sure Danny here can say a thing or two also about fighting corruption. That's been his life. That's been his whole life. And I'm not the expert by any means, but I think, what I try to capture is when you're trying to engage and deal with very tough policy issues, you take a lot of risks. And obviously, it's not evident sometimes when you start just how deep or bad those risks can be. But we all know intellectually that when we try to reform, there are always winners and losers. There are vested interests. I think it's not that we don't know they are. We sometimes don't appreciate the degree to which they are vested. The vested interests are vested in not allowing things to change. And so I don't know how this links into your citizen engagement accountability, but in an effort to do 2 or 3 things in my country, Nigeria. One is, close revenue leakages, open up and have more transparency in government accounts and the way that we do business, introduce techniques of auditing expenditures in a way that will enable us to be held more accountable for our actions by the public. Of course, you run into interests who are living off of, whose, how should I say, livelihood depends on some of these. So what am I talking about? One of the examples I gave in the book came from the oil industry. And as all of you know, 70% of the revenues in Nigeria come from oil. And we have an oil subsidy program, which had been a source of some serious revenue leakages. And when I came in as finance minister the second time around, in 2011, 2012, I tell the story of how practically one of the first things that was made evident to me was that the staff in my budget office were very alarmed because the rate at which they had been paying out on these subsidies was getting higher and higher. They were very concerned. When I left government the first time, we had about $2 billion in subsidies. So we subsidized purchase of oil at the pump. And most Nigerians liked it because they felt that's the only benefit they ever got from oil. We had about $2 billion in subsidies. By the time I came back, they had already paid out something almost equivalent to 11 billion. And so they were very concerned that something was wrong. And to cut a long story short, I went to the president and said the only way we could find out, there were so many rumors flying about the place that there was a lot of fraud involved, was to audit the accounts. And he gave the permission to do that. So we assembled a team from Pricewaterhouse, from the Central Bank, of about 15 forensic auditors and inspectors. And they spent about 6 weeks auditing these accounts. They audited $8 billion worth of payments, and we found $2.4 billion worth of fraud in those $8 billion. So we simply refused to pay. So we said, you know, because all these people who were importing this oil were claiming from government payments. Because after you import, you sell, then you present your bill to be compensated for the subsidy. But it turned out that a lot of them were perpetrating a lot of fraud. For instance, this audit showed there were some people who claimed a certain ship had delivered oil in Nigeria. That was part of the audit on a particular date, which had been, you know, delivered and sold. Well, Lloyd's Register has the movement of all ships in the world. And when we looked at Lloyd's Register, that ship was in China at the time they were supposed to be delivering oil in Nigeria. So those are the kinds of pieces of evidence that we were able to assemble. So of course, when we found this, we said we were not going to pay those companies. But there are people very vested in that, and all kinds of hell broke loose. And to cut a long story short, the risk that I talk about in it was that my mother got kidnapped and she's still alive. So whenever I tell this story, thank God she's 89 now, she was 83. She was kidnapped and held for 5 days. And when she asked the kidnappers why they had taken her, because she was abducted on a Sunday as she was coming back from church in front of her house. The reason we know why is because they told her, there were 4 young men, that your daughter refused to pay the oil marketers. And I think they were frank with her because they were going to kill her. So she overheard them on the 5th day talking to someone on the phone, and they were asking what to do with her body in pidgin English. So I think they did not know, to cut a long story short, the government was wonderful. There was an all points alert. They were searching everywhere. And I think maybe it got too hot. And they abandoned her in the forest where she was being held, and she was able to find her way back. So and so she was able to recount to us why, what they said, what she overheard, etc. And it all traced back to the fact that these people felt that I had not paid. The second piece of evidence that we have, that it was all about that non-payment, was during the time she was being held, they made contact with one of my brothers in my parents' house, who was waiting. You know, initially we thought it was an ordinary kidnap at home, and they were going to ask for $50 million or some outrageous sum. But what they asked for on the phone was that I should go to the television, announce my resignation publicly, and leave the country. So these are some of the things that happen when you try to clean up, when you try to bring integrity, when you try to intervene. And by the way, they don't leave you. It takes a long time. And when you're trying to engage, to be transparent, to be open, the people you're fighting with, they fight viciously back. And these people followed me and fought me for I don't know how many years in all sorts of ways. So, you know, that is just a snapshot. So I decided to write about it as a point of showing people, especially people like Danny, you know, that when you actually go on the ground to fight corruption, it is vicious. It is risky. And those people who are trying to do it need the most amount of support that all of you from outside can muster. That's really the point.
Great. And Ngozi could have gone on to mention that she faced the question whether to cave in to the kidnappers, which would have required a big amount of money from government, which would have been corruption, or not to cave in, which would have put her mother at greater risk.
Actually, to cave in would be not the money. The cave in would have been to leave the country. Yeah, resign. That's what they wanted me to do. It was nothing about money. It was about me resigning and leaving the country. So do I do that and save my mother's life? Or do I not do it and risk not coming back?
So why didn't you do it?
My father. That's the simple answer. He insisted that I was not going to resign. He's a retired professor of economics and a demographer. So he said to me, look, we've outlived the life expectancy. You know, he said life expectancy is 50. Your mother and I are in our 80s. I think it's more important for you not to stay where you are and not leave. We are no longer as useful to society. I'm sure if someone had written that somewhere else, they would have been in big trouble, right? And he insisted that I not resign.
So let's take, if the poll everywhere system is working, if you want to start feeding the questions in, or the cards and the papers, and as that's happening, and Ngozi, let me come back to the question I asked you. What messages would you like to convey to generators of evidence, people who care about evaluation, people who care about evidence generation and evaluation being useful to policymakers? What advice would you give to them?
I think there are two things, David. I may not answer it the way you want. When you're a policymaker, it's good to have evidence generated, but more importantly is to have it analyzed in a form you can digest and that can really impact policy. What you find is that sometimes you have a lot of data collected on different issues at different points. But that is never presented to a policymaker in a simple, digestible format that you can use to change things. And that was the biggest problem. So my strong advice would be, keep it simple. You know, try to focus on what are the questions these people who are making policy really want answered. Because we can generate lots of data about everything, right? And it may not be useful. What is it they are trying to achieve? And what's the singular 2 or 3 questions they want to answer? And then if you collect data, keep it simple, analyze and present in a digestible format that can enable changes in policy. That's what I would have liked. So you collected lots of data. And by the way, the other thing about data is integrity. There's no point collecting tons of data everywhere that are suspect. So it is very important to work, because once they are suspect, then the authorities, even if you analyze it, already begin to question the data rather than focus on the issue. I strongly suggest making sure you don't just generate your own information, but work with the statistical agency or some authority in the country that has credibility, because in doing that, you build the capacity of that agency. You also, coming from outside, also help them enhance their own visibility and status and get more acceptability for them. And you work with them because you leave something behind. So mine is more about institution building, about keeping it simple, whatever the source of data is, and making it in a digestible and policy actionable format.
So the questions are flowing in. Was there a lesson to bank project staff about taking seriously the community, what you described about the road. So run it even beyond bank staff. Was there a lesson from that experience that you told us at the outset that people who are active in either implementing or evaluating programs should take to heart?
Absolutely. It is the ability to correct action mid-course. That's what I took from that. And it's not always easy at the bank to mid-course change the way a project is configured and rethink it, be willing to go through all the hoops to get the additional financing and whatever is needed. So that's the lesson. And I was really proud that people were, one, willing to listen to, willing to course correct, and taking a component they had not thought of, and then two, to deliver that, you know, by listening to the people in the village. And, you know, these are not the chiefs only, because some people think that listening to people is coming and talking to the village chief and one or two other people. That's not always the right way. You should find citizen-based organizations, which we all have within our villages, that can deliver.
So I don't know whether whoever's controlling this can scroll back to the top, but they're coming through so fast we can't keep up with them. Thank you. Here it comes. How do you create a culture that within government and between government and other voices that encourages constructive discussion of open policies, of policy options, I should say? So do you have any reflections from your experience on how you bridge the gaps that make it possible for people to converse about evidence?
I think it's not very easy for government. You know, governments will tell you they are listening to the people or they want to listen. Maybe they listen once every few years when they vote. But even that is not listening. And, you know, people don't really, I mean, policymakers, first of all, most of the time they're over their heads with issues. Two, they set a course of action and they themselves don't want to correct course. I think the only way to get them to listen to people is by making information available to people. Once you can get information out about a certain course of policy for people to appreciate, then they begin to ask questions. And those questions can be uncomfortable and at least will force some degree of engagement and answers, you know, to the people who are concerned. And I mean, one of the ways we fostered citizen engagement in public financial management in Nigeria was to publish the revenue allocations of government every month. Had never been done before. In the newspapers, we publish what each state got, each local government got, what the federal government ministries got. We loaded it on the website for those who were web savvy, but the newspaper was the way. These days, you would find a way to load it on social media and so on and so forth. And that generated so much interest that even I could not believe. And I had asked the president, this was the first time I was finance minister, if we could do that. Because I would go to a forum in a state, you know, a local government, and the antagonism towards the federal government and towards me as finance minister was palpable. People were hostile. And I began to ask, why is it that they are so hostile to the federal government? It was because they were being told then by their state governors that, well, we couldn't pay teachers because federal government didn't release money. We couldn't build the roads because we couldn't repair because they didn't release money. We couldn't, you know, so many things. So when you appeared as a federal government official at any of these functions, people were loading all the blame for what was going wrong in their lives on you. Not knowing that this was not true, money had been released and they should be holding their what? State governors and local government people accountable. So it was because of that experience we started to publish this information. And once people started seeing this, it was a revelation to them. What? So this state got $2 million this month and teachers are not paid? So they began to hold their state governors accountable, to ask them questions. Some of the local governments did not even have their monies remitted to them. They were held back at the state level. They too began to ask questions. They used to sneak and come in at night and ask me if I could give them the numbers for their local government of what they got. And this made myself and my team and everybody on that highly unpopular with the governors. Till today, as you can imagine. So an exercise in generating accountability does not make you popular. You have to decide what you want, get information out, get citizen engagement, or be liked.
And I think you've just commented nicely on one of the other questions here, which is the tension between short-term political benefits of addressing symptoms versus the medium-term challenges or benefits of dealing with root causes. So let's hold the conversation there, not finish it, but hold it there while we now switch to you, Danny. And I'm going to give you a chance. First, Danny Kaufmann, well known to many people here, in addition to his leadership on issues around governance and corruption in connection with the extractive industries or the natural resources and the organization that he's head. He has been a contributor and advisor on governance generally for many years. And in many ways, he's an advisor of practically every panel you can imagine. So really thoughtful about all of these issues. And Danny, let's start with, if you have any questions for Ngozi that you'd like to ask, feel free. And then we'll switch to you. And I want to start, the question to you is reflections that you have, since you're the last speaker of the day, reflections you have on what you've heard and maybe what you've not heard today from your perspective. Not asking you to summarize, not asking you to reflect every perspective, but you bring a particular set of experiences and knowledge to this. And what reflections do you have that we should take away? We should say, oh, we forgot this, or we didn't emphasize that, or something that really struck you as important. So you can take them in those two steps. First, any questions you have for Ngozi, and then that first question.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm most interested in.
You want to take one? No.
Thanks very much, David. And I really appreciate that you're asking me to also ask a question to Ngozi, because otherwise it's an impossible act to follow, obviously. What can I say after Ngozi? And I do have a question, which I will start with a personal anecdote, because obviously it involves Ngozi. And this is about 15 or a bit more years ago. You, Ngozi, were already the super minister of the economy and finance in Nigeria after one of the World Bank stints, and you asked me to come to your country because we were doing evidence-based governance and anti-corruption work. You felt already back then that this was such a priority, and the importance of evidence-based in that notion. You organized the whole cabinet, including the president, and we had a fascinating meeting, and you encouraged me. I still remember, please, I was a World Banker. The slides have to be very simple and very clear, and make it very clear. And you were incredibly aware about the importance of internalizing the data, but not only with that group. So the question there, and you just made such a different potent illustrations of that more than that is needed, but you also said you started your own company of polling and so on, which was a very important initiative, and I remember our discussions at the time on that. And this came throughout the day today, that even some questioning about just the value of information, or even questioning whether more subjective or quantitative data is maybe preferred in some cases. Questioning whether no matter what one does with the data is not going to reach many in the population, which I would challenge. I think we have failed to some extent in terms of communicating much more broadly. But I'd like to hear your reflections since those days as to what is needed that we have not gotten it right yet regarding the mix between the right type of information, rigorous enough and so on, but to disseminate it and project it much more widely to have an impact and complement it with what? Beyond information.
Okay. Thanks, Danny. Yes, I remember and the powerful statements you made with especially comparisons. What worked very well in those days was when you compared Nigeria on several dimensions to other countries and what they were doing on the transparency front. But coming back to your question on data and people doubting data, maybe it's also my training as an economist. I simply do not believe that, at least let me speak for myself as a policymaker, that I could live in a world in which I would be able to make decisions without having some evidence on which to base it on, where that is available. I mean, there are cases where it's not available, but where it is available, it is always important to sift through that information and make the decisions or the policies you're going to make based on that, and not just on anecdotal or what people are telling you. So I'm not in the school of those who believe that, quantitative data doesn't matter anymore, or, evidence. No. I think it matters even more in these days of so much. I saw something about fake news and fake, not just fake news, but fake information on the internet. So I think one of the big things, Danny, more than the information that policymakers worry about now, is the integrity of that information. Can I really believe this? Where does this come from? How do I know that this information is real? I think that is something that is what is very concerning to policymakers, and that's why I suggested that working with the institutions within a country, and helping to have a long-term goal on information. Don't just be fixated by, I have my project or my program or my evaluation thing. What can I collect now that I can use? Have a longer-term perspective of which institution can I work with over time and build up, so that before I come on mission, they already have the information. They are trusted by the policymakers, even if they don't like what they say. I think you take the example of the National Bureau of Statistics in Nigeria now, which has had a good leader over time and has built up some credibility, so that when it delivers information, even if policymakers don't like it, they are now more accepting. I'm not saying they're 100%. So that's what I think the gap is, in credible information, not just information. Information I can believe in, to a credible institution behind it, and simplicity of delivery of that information.
Thanks, Ngozi. Over to you now, Dan.
Thank you, Ngozi. And that's a good segue then to a few remarks, if you allow me, with humility, because I'm following Ngozi, but we'll come back, I'm sure, to you and the discussion. And what I will try to do is distill some of the admittedly biased notions that I gathered through the day, and put it in a handful of points, which I will not be able to do full justice, so that we have a fuller discussion. But for full disclosure, to say up front that they do reflect where I come from, some of my views. So this should not be construed as a summary or doing full justice to the incredible richness, expertise, and experience of every participant and panelist today. And I will start from the bottom up, because I was asked to say something also that is related to the enormous richness of the evaluators and the evaluations that have been done by both the World Bank, 3IE, and many others that are sitting here. So one issue that came through the day, and it goes to Ngozi's point about the absolute importance in this era of the fact-based challenge by fake news and others, is where do we go next then regarding the evaluation models and the data that will be generated. And one concern that was heard implicitly and somewhat explicitly through the day is regarding the relevance and validity, particularly external validity, if one just subscribed to one model like RCTs. On the other extreme, it was mentioned, well, let's not underestimate just how...
What's RCTs?
Randomized controlled trials.
Controlled trials, okay.
Yeah, so
okay.
The randomized, which have gathered major attention over the past few years, and it's much of the incentive structure nowadays in academia that's going in that direction, which has been questioned in terms of many of the practitioners and many of the organizations where we work. Okay, but how do we draw inferences that are useful today or even in 6 months when it's something very expensive, not necessarily scalable or replicable? Now, it has been traversing to more meta-evaluations and drawing from 6, 7, 8, 9 studies, and that can be useful, but there may be a call here for also considering integration with other methods, which some organizations do use, more mixed methods. But I'd like to also bring back, and I betray here my gray hair, and as an economist, remember econometrics? I think the fact that many years ago there was some discrediting, and for some good reason, about simple, ordinary least squares. At one point of time, econometric methods, that does not mean that the field does not evolve significantly in terms of statistical econometrics, and nowadays also with big data, to be able to encompass those very rigorous but alternative type of techniques that could be used in the future. And particularly because there is a call of more relevant, not just micro data, what may be relevant in one village in Uganda, but because of the issues that Ngozi is bringing up at the full sectoral, or even more so at the macro level. So that's one call, and one issue I'd like to put forward is to think through how to move beyond the evaluation model extremes and integrate it more fully, while continuing a major commitment to data which is as accurate and as good as possible, which has been very much a push in our field, in the field where I'm now as leading the Natural Resource Governance Institute, which is in natural resources, and thanks to Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative and many of the other initiatives that we do, and I mean, I've been involved with the ITF for many years, there has been a major push towards more information, more transparency in that area. And that leads to the second point, which also came up earlier, and it was even framed in ways that I've seen it framed in many places, including in our field, the balancing act between rigor and mass dissemination or access. And I'd like to put also the case that we need to traverse beyond that notion that is a balancing act needed, as if there was a trade-off. And that goes again to the point that Ngozi made. Rigor, accurate information, and so on, at some point should be considered as non-negotiable. And if we're not being successful enough in making this information more accessible and more disseminatable to others is because we're failing, as you said, on the communication and information dissemination side, and not because we are being too rigorous. And we can give a number of examples of fantastically Nobel Prize type economists that are very successful in mass dissemination and in publishing every week in the New York Times and many other things. So at some point we should consider that, okay, let's be more humble, and maybe we're not doing that job earlier, rather than pretending that there is a balancing act that needs to be done. If anything, in the field where I traverse, sometimes evaluations I don't think are rigorous enough, and so on. So let's not negotiate on that. Which leads to the third point. I'm traversing slowly up, and I'll make 5 quick points. Is beyond, since I'm suggesting going beyond, because we may be facing a non-linear moment here, beyond TAP. What is TAP? It's a short for transparency, accountability, and participation field. We can call it different words, but just for short, because here where citizen participation, accountability, transparency is at the midst of that. It has been kind of a field, an industry that has developed over the past 15, 20 years. Many of us, you here, belong to that field. Let me make 2 observations there, again, for the sake of discussion, and relates to some of the issues Ngozi mentioned, but also earlier in the day. Why haven't we been seen, and evaluations are showing that, as being as successful as expected? Okay? Well, first, put this in perspective, and particularly World Bank, and I'm a former World banker, and Ngozi was partly, on great part, responsible for that. But yeah, fast rewind to the mid-90s, before Jim Wolfensohn comes in. Then Jim Wolfensohn comes in, brings in Ngozi, and a game change. It starts, both in terms of corruption not being taboo as an element of discussion anymore. We had to write sit ... instead of the full-fledged word for corruption in those old days. David would remember that, and Ngozi, and the whole notion of civil society participation was not taken. When I took the job of the first head of mission to start the program when Ukraine becomes independent after the Soviet Union collapses, I was scolded by the then, that's just before Wolfensohn comes in, chief legal counsel for engaging with parliament and civil society. That was not part of the mandate of the World Bank. I had only to deal with the Minister of Finance. So, I mean, the road traversed ought not to be made. But that's 25 years ago. The question is whether now we may be at the tipping point of reconsidering what's needed next, given how much the world has changed, not just 25 years, but even in the past 5 years regarding this issue. So in terms of transparency, accountability, and participation, just a couple of quick thoughts. One is the challenge within TAP. Transparency, accountability, and participation. And this is part and parcel of a research project I'm involved with Brookings and R4D. We are finding that obviously transparency alone was not delivering the goods, and that was the earlier stage of the movement. Then it traverses to saying we need accountability too, so transparency plus accountability, and then participation gets into the mix. Each time it improves some, but still not fully there. One insight, and that comes from our work on the Resource Governance Index and report of 2 years ago, and now 3IE has done more in-depth work, is the implementation challenge. Even if those 3 areas are well designed, or relatively well designed, but then somehow one issue is to adopt the policies, the regulations, and the laws that is needed, so it's in the law, but it doesn't necessarily get into practice and implemented, and there are all kinds of reasons for that. But then less obvious to our field has been, even where that happened and implementation is done, the goods are not fully delivered because there are absolutely crucial complementary reforms outside of the TAP field, whether it's in terms of legal reforms, administrative reform, public finance reforms, or Warren Frank-Kraft-Schick reform that. That's something that the likes of you fully understand. But we're still, all of us, not just in this sector, the TAP sector, but others, a bit siloized, and we do not consider sufficiently the importance of those complementary factors. We call them context that has to be taken into account, or we call it ecosystems, which is a favorite word, when in fact what's happening is that in those other areas there can be interventions, and the lawyers working on that areas consider us TAP as context and ecosystem. So I would like to put forth the importance of moving forward in that context, more integration, which implies interdisciplinary work, not only intersectoral, but interdisciplinary work on that. Fourth, moving forward quickly, the whole premise today, and it is as it is mostly in this type of discussion in field, is based on the interactions of two stakeholders and agents. And that's citizens, citizen participation vis-a-vis governments. This is also the model in OGP, Open Government Partnership. It has been the World Bank IBRD model and IDA model for a long time. We have already taken a different route where we work out of total necessity, which is natural resources. Industry is at least as important. So it's really at least tripartite for industry, including investors and so on. And that creates a very different dynamic also in terms of modeling how it happened, in terms of the interactions with industry. This focus on corporate, quickly, leads to the last beyond challenge. So this is a beyond the two agent type of model. And the last I'd like to suggest at this juncture, one that has re-emerged in some sense with a bit of a fury of work that my colleague at the bank at the time, Joel Hellman, and myself started about 2 decades ago in economies of transition at the time, particularly the former socialist economies. And it refers to the work on state capture. State capture essentially referring not to the influencing of bribery that happens in the implementation of the regulations and the red tape and so on, that one can affect that for the private benefit of one, which is a traditional approach to corruption. But it's what Ngozi was talking earlier, is the shaping of the rules of the game, of the rules, of the policies, of the regulations of the state, where the corporates as well as elite, the corporate elite as well as the political elite can play a very key role. Why is that important here? In particular nowadays, not only because it has become more relevant in a number of absolutely key countries, and what more emblematic case recently as the whole Petrobras Odebrecht scandal that starts in Brazil, but has afflicted all of Latin America, and in about 5 countries investments are paralyzed as a result. David would know that very well, but also in the countries like Ukraine, Indonesia, and many others. South Africa was mentioned in that context earlier today by Warren Kraft-Schick. He's from South Africa, and we collaborate. I was asked to be, and that's the last anecdote in my initial comments, I was asked to be an expert witness from outside before the recently created Commission on State Capture in South Africa. I made it very clear I do not comment on South Africa or prosecutorial issues. No, that's for them. They were doing that work. This is with a key jurist in the country. But interestingly enough, the whole discussion, it was over 3 hours on this, evolved into lessons, as you said, from other countries of the world. What can be done systemically to approach it, including the role of accountability, civil society, and so on. The concern in many countries about this, and by the way, the same Minister of Finance I was referred to in this morning, now is in a different ministry, but the major plea was, can we put just in 2 graphs so that the population sees the impact on poverty, the impact on infant mortality, the impact on that. So these people who really care, and the leaders are thinking hard how to translate that and how to translate that for more citizen engagement on this issue. I'm myself from Chile, a very proud citizen of the country, has done it, but that's for later we have the time. There is a case also where there has been a mobilization not only of citizens and NGOs, but working together with other stakeholders to make a difference regarding issues of corruption and corruption.
Thank you, Danny. We have about 15 more minutes in this session, and then there is a final session for a few wrap-up remarks. I think from Manny and Allison? From Allison, okay. Okay. So it's a chance in the rest of this session and moving into the wrap-up to draw some threads together from today. So as you ask questions, I encourage you to do some of that and to kind of kick that off. It seems to me, but I'm ready to be challenged on this, that our discussions today, as in many other discussions like this, have reflected what I'll describe as 2 different clans or groups or tribes or whatever, trying to understand each other and reach out and connect with each other. And one of those is those who generate evidence, and the other are the policymakers who are the intended users and who want the evidence. And sometimes each clan talks amongst itself and says, we really ought to understand what the others are doing. And we really ought to be more attuned to what the others are doing. But those conversations are 2 separate campfires, and the actual learning from each other is hard going and doesn't always happen. So can we make progress in bridging that gap? Because if we don't, we'll continue to have the same sense that there's a difficulty in connecting the generation and the use of evidence. So I'm going to toss out 5 ideas that might be useful to think about whenever any kind of evaluation is done. And people can, I'm sure, improve on this. First, who is it for? Be pretty clear on who is it for. And we've heard lots of things today. There's a difference between the country and the government. There's a difference between the population and special interests. And there are many other who's it for questions. Second, what will it take to give them, the primary audience, to gain from the primary audience their trust? So we heard Ngozi today say, they really have to trust you if they're going to listen to you. No matter how good our evidence is, they have to first have that trust issue. So what will it take to gain the trust of whoever it's for? Third question, what will it take to meet their needs? What are their needs? And what will it take to, they want something. They don't necessarily want 3-stage least squares, general equilibrium models, whatever it is. So we have to attune to that. Fourth, what degree of precision or evidence will it take for them to say, I think we know enough to make a decision now? So, sort of match the level of precision and therefore the amount of work involved to the audience and its needs. That's the fourth. And then the fifth, what do we as evidence generators need to do in order to arm, meaning give ammunition to the policymakers so that they can carry their case with their constituencies, arm them with evidence and stories and narratives. So I'm just tossing those ideas out to think about and inviting further questions. And so let me come back to our two panelists. One of the questions has been, what makes you, both of you, what makes you optimistic about change? How can we reinforce forces for good? So give us a few rays of hope that we can go out with renewed energy as we go forward. Both of you. Who wants to start? Danny?
Go first. No, you go first.
Well, maybe this is the opportunity. The most, and I'm biased, of course, where I work, but I do believe it, and I was speaking before with key people in the bank working on fragility. Fragility is a nice concept. You started working on that at first, fragile state, before the quasi-failed, fragile state. The intersection between fragility and resource dependency is enormous. So arguably, the most important challenge nowadays in development is improving governance in resource-dependent countries. And we have data showing. 1990, MDGs start, okay? 20% of the world population lives in resource-dependent country, out of which 25% of the poor lives there. So almost proportional, not quite. Governance has continued to deteriorate in those countries, not markedly, but it does not improve. While in the rest of the world, it has improved, okay? If that picture doesn't change, by 2030, over half of the poor is going to be in resource-rich country, 1 billion people, and that would not have declined at all, even though in the rest of the world there's a massive decline. So that's very sobering. What makes me optimistic is that that's an average picture, is very sobering. Most countries have not been progressing, but there is a group of countries, even with having those resources and many initial challenges, that are showing that yes, it can be done, including in Africa. And we have great examples, including of disclosures at the micro level, at the sector level, and at the macro level, the Ghana, Botswana, and so on. And obviously, countries like like Chile, and there are some in Asia, are showing that yes, it can be done. Let me just give very quickly what happened in Chile. There was a scandal, a corruption scandal, which some friends in a neighboring country said that it would not have been news in the neighboring country, but in a country with a commitment to governance, governance is not assessed by the absence of corruption or by the absence of the governance challenge, it's by the ability, capacity, willingness to respond to those challenges, and you would know that best. So there is a response. An independent commission is formed of academic, think tank, people, private sector, and so on. Nobody from the government. Within 45 days, they issue a set of far-reaching recommendations to address, including very tough issues of capture, political finance, procurement, private sector corruption, and so on. Three key factors why it worked, and over half of the far-reaching recommendations have been implemented. One is the fact of the credibility of such an independent approach and the legitimacy that it had and the people that it comprised. Second is forming an observatory independently of the commission was formed, civil society, NGO, and a think tank to monitor what was going on related to each one of the reform. And third, and crucially, a campaign by some CSOs, NGOs, vis-a-vis all the parliamentarians, because parliamentary elections were about to come in. They commit or they don't commit to this transparency and reform agenda and put them in notice, otherwise the incentive was that their job was on the line. Result is very significant. So this is, of course, a biased example. It's my own country, but I wanted to illustrate. But they are far. The challenge is that this is still a minority. But yes, it can be done. This is not a historically deterministic type of challenge. We were nowhere there 30 years ago. To the contrary, 50% of the population was below the poverty line when the autocrat in power, Pinochet, lives in 89. Nowadays it's 12%. So let me leave.
Well, I think three things give me hope. And they also give me trepidation. The first one is, in an interesting way, demographics. Demographics, and this is strange. In the developed countries, quote unquote, or the industrialized countries, the demographics is working against youth. So people are aging, declining. Productivity is in a longer term decline unless we do something with AI and robotics and so on. In the developing countries, so you know, if you look by 2030, I think about 20-something% of the population in Europe will be 65 and over. And in North America, it will be about 17%, but in Africa, it will be 6% only. So if you look at those numbers, I say it gives me hope, because I think that what is happening in the world, we have a generation of young people, predominantly in my continent, who need to get angry. They need to find some of the things that are happening unacceptable. The older people are willing to compromise, keep quiet, let things go. These people, from what I sense of them, are not willing. So I have hope that they are going to get angry. And I'm talking of, you know, these demographics. So when I say it gives me hope for my continent, not for those in the industrialized countries. You don't have hope. Unless you allow us to have, you know, economists want free flow of goods, services, but no free flow of labor, right? Yeah. So we have it. And they should get angry. They will get angry. They will demand differently. That gives me hope, number one. The second thing is technology. Even the simplest of technologies, like the mobile phone, because it's making information more ubiquitous. And it's making people get access. Yes, some of it is fake news and dangerous, but there's also a lot of good information and eye-opening information that is leading people to ask questions. And ask their policymakers, why is it that people over there can have this and we cannot? So that gives me hope that will push for accountability. I think the third thing that gives me hope is angry young women and angry older women. In short, angry women. I think women are coming out and they're not accepting things as they are anymore. And they're asking a lot of questions and they're leading in different ways, as Tina Brown just wrote in an article. You know, and they are demanding differently. And that's also going to put its own kind of pressure. So between very young people in Africa and angry old and young women armed with technology, I think I have a lot of hope.
We just have a few more minutes, so I'd like to ask each of you in 2 minutes to give us any last...
We're off the hook.
No, not yet. Any more thoughts that you want to share? And if you're grasping for a hook, I'll give you one more, and that is, are you more or less optimistic now than you were some years ago as you take into account what's happening politically in this country and other countries, fake news, the whole story. Are you more or less optimistic? If so, why? You can also ignore that question and just give your final thoughts. Who wants to start? Ngozi?
Okay, since Danny went. I mean, I think you have to know I'm a little biased because I'm an optimist by nature. And when I can't solve one problem, I move on to the next one I can solve. And don't spend all my time, worrying about the things I can't solve. I also take a long-term view. So whilst I'm not particularly happy or pleased or particularly optimistic about the juncture we are now, there are term limits. People will go. Countries will survive them. They may be in worse shape, institutionally, economically, and I'm including not just this country, various other countries. Because you've got Brexit going on, and what is happening there is unbelievable to those who thought the UK was a rock. And you've got, in Germany even, there's woolliness at the edges because of the rights of the far right. In Italy, you have people advising against taking vaccinations, and an anti-vax movement. Can you imagine? When, I had an organization that was set up because the children in developing countries did not have access to life-saving vaccines. Now we have people in developed countries telling their children not to get vaccinated and causing problems for children in the countries we are working in. So you've got craziness in so many places. And the interesting thing to me is that it's happening in the so-called developed countries. And then, of course, it gives permission and space for craziness in developing countries to happen even more. And for leaders to not be accountable. So in the short term, of course, I'm not comfortable. I'm puzzled. I'm worried. I'm concerned. I'm impatient. But when I take a little bit of a longer term look, it helps me to calm down. And we must go for longer term things. And when these things, we pray for one thing, that the institutions are not too undermined. Because I'm a very institution-based person. But even if they manage to undermine them, I'm sure there'll be plenty of people ready and willing to repair. So that's what gives me hope. It is not forever. So what you have to do is manage what you can have impact on. And then try not to worry too much about what you can't change.
Again, what can I say? Maybe two complementary reflections. One, sorry, to be dry, a bit wonky, and maybe the second related to Ngozi and others. The wonky one is, if we accept the notion that there has been and it's ongoing enormous change, we superimpose it to the notion that we cannot predict which way these changes will continue going. The only thing that is certain is that there will be more change. And what you're discussing, we haven't discussed enough this whole notion of the closing civic space, which is related to the threat to democracy, what's taking place. What you just mentioned about industrial, the rich world. If we accept that notion, and it's being done in some models, but I don't think insufficiently integrated into all our work, whether evaluation, our sector work, the notion of embracing uncertainty. And embracing uncertainty also means to be very cognizant to when we speak, when we give advice, it's always subject to a range, to a doubt, to a margin of error. This is something that with my co-author at the World Bank, we have been doing this for 20-some years, the worldwide governance indicators. I know, controversial enough and so on, but it has served a purpose, including, by the way, we haven't discussed here, we discuss industry, but the role of markets in the work we do. And once risk rating agency and the markets adopt many of this information and the metrics, it does provide a very powerful incentive. That's an aside. But from the very first day, and then thankfully it was emulated by a number of others, the notion of margin of error in everything we do. We are in the social sciences. We know that even GDP numbers are subject for a very significant margin of error for a variety of political and other reasons that's not usually measured or put very officially out. But in our fields and where we work, I think it's very important to put that. But that also applies to, in terms of the range of options and when evaluation is done, in terms of both the implications and what needs to be done to design projects better. Let's embrace the notion that they need to be experimentation. Theories of change of this era and the era ahead ought not be linear and pretending that we know exactly what's going to be the path. And nowadays, there are very rigorous methods to integrate in an almost certain fashion uncertainty. So, and I think much of this discussion embraces that. Let's embrace doubting. I mean, just because some of us at different points during the day are up here doesn't mean that we have the answers. The best definition of an expert was given by Mark Twain 100-some years ago when he said, an expert is somebody from out of town. So, let's put that in that context. And that leads to the...
And experts are dead anyway. They're totally out of fashion.
So, grain of salt, but not a grain of salt, but that can be nowadays done more rigorously, including the data itself. There are such methods now that the data itself, one can be very transparent and precise about the extent of imprecision in the data. And those are the type of models we have used. And that's, I hope that we can discuss that further with the evaluation community. Regarding optimism or not, yes, because of all what Ngozi mentioned, very cautious, because we have a very serious problem, particularly in a number of absolutely crucial rich countries, industrialized countries. And they watch each other. We can discuss until midnight what collusion exists or not. But the sharing of information and watching each other's shoulders and what's happening in terms of the movement away from democratic institutions is very, very real. And it's not just looking here, but the most important country in the former Soviet Union. I was just in Istanbul recently, and we can mention a number of others. And then it's a different dynamic of what's happening with Brexit. Now, what gives hope, and I go back, and I will not mention again the whole case of Chile, but in Latin America, it's not universal. But in Latin America nowadays, there's a movement. It's a two-tier movement. One is citizens. For the past 5 years and so on, we have detected, and even in some of the evidence, they have said enough in terms of tolerance about impunity and corruption. That has not happened. We'll see whether tomorrow this has happened in Israel or not, which is a countrywide study, so I know very well. So it has not happened universally, where there's been a certain tolerance to these problems and issues for a variety of reasons among citizens. In Latin America, we crossed the Rubicon already a few years ago, and that's at the citizen level, and we have witnessed basically heads of states losing their jobs because of citizen participation and other major movements, the Perus, and what's happening in Brazil, and so on. Second, at the higher level, among enlightened leaders, they are saying, we are now on our own. We cannot rely on the United States or on other big countries. This is our opportunity then. So there are countries which before were considered part of one of the spheres of influence of the big ones that have been growing, have been more successful, that are prepared then to go the next stage on their own. As a citizen of one of these emerging countries, I consider that very powerful and very important. The last point I wanted to make on this, and that's a question mark. At the end of the day, we have danced around one key aspect of good governance, and that's we have not mentioned, and that's courageous leaders. That's why it's fantastic to have the honor to be with Ngozi here. I cannot really tell. It's very difficult to measure, and the margin of error can be large. I cannot really tell whether we may be entering an era of more or less of those. And if the era is going to be of less of those because either capture, fear, or others, we are in trouble. Because ultimately, people and leaders can make such an enormous difference. Thank you.
So, please come back 100 years from now when we reconvene this session to find out how it comes out. With apologies to all the wonderful questions. We didn't get to all of them, and apologies to Allison for being a little bit late, but take the extra time. Please join me in thanking our wonderful panel.
It was great.